Natural and economic ecosystems have one thing in common. They evolved through a process of creative destruction. Those are the words of one of India's top economic advisors. He's speaking to us about India's economy, how Delhi is playing the art of the deal with Trump's tariffs, and why the country needs creative destruction to fuel innovation. I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on Taiwan Plus. Sanjeev Sanyal, author, historian, and member of the Indian Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Thank you very much for joining us from New Delhi.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to kick off with this social media post, which you released soon after Donald Trump unleashed his global tariff regime. Now, you wrote in Hindi, and let me translate. It says, some non-resident Indian relatives have started requesting to bring back 4 packets of paracetamol and an iPhone, referring to requests for products from India. Can you explain?
Well, it was meant in jest, quite frankly. But basically, the point is that if you ended up with very high tariffs on all other countries, then obviously relatives in those countries will ask you to bring products from the origin countries. But let me clarify that this is only in jest, and in reality, taxes on pharmaceuticals and indeed on iPhones have not been imposed. So it's actually just meant in jest.
Okay. Well, going back to the to Trump's tariffs and how that's affecting the continent, and in particular, the knock-on effect for India. The New York Times headlined recently that Trump's trade war with China could be good for India. That was echoed by CNBC. How much is the Indian government looking at this as an opportunity, given that the Indian government has managed to negotiate somewhat quite well with the Trump administration?
So far, we have not been affected badly. Do remember that 2/3 of our exports to the US are actually services, which have not been part of this tariff war. Even of the 1/3 that we do export to the US as merchandise, a lot of it is things like pharmaceuticals, which I just discussed, but also electronics of the kind like iPhones, which also have so far not been a part of this tariff hike. So overall, our exports are not that badly affected. Even in the categories where there is some impact, the hikes in tariffs on our competitor countries are higher. So I don't think we here in India are so far being affected too badly. In fact, as you know, we are in advanced talks on having some wireframe for a free trade agreement. It may not be comprehensive, but it will be at least a start. And we hope that before the end of the year, we will have a basic free trade agreement with the US in place.
In general, it seems that many economists and analysts are optimistic about how India could handle the tariffs, not just for India, but how it could benefit somewhat from the tariffs being slapped on other countries. And many are saying that it could see companies shifting productions to India, pushing it to possibly becoming the factory of the world as China once was. Do you see it that way too?
Well, this is certainly an opportunity. I'm not sure this will happen unless we on our side push through these of doing business, make sure infrastructure is in place and so on. So this is an opportunity for India, certainly. And if that FTA comes through, and not just with the US, but also with the UK, where we are fairly advanced as well in our discussions, and then perhaps with the European Union as well. So it's certainly an opportunity, but we in India know that this opportunity will be reality only if we pull up our socks and get on with expanding our infrastructure, ease of doing business, all of which we are very aware of. And in recent years, we have done quite a lot of work in that. So you're right, it is indeed an opportunity.
But this brings me now to the phrase that you've used in a column, in a recent column you wrote for the New Indian Express called creative destruction. Firstly, can you explain, and how does that apply to India's current ecosystem?
So the point I was making is that rapid economic progress ultimately is driven by new companies, new entrepreneurs, risk-taking of all kinds. And the point I was making is that look at the new companies that have emerged out of, say, the US in the last 25 years. Look at whether Meta, Alphabet, Tesla, or look at Chinese companies that have emerged, such as BYD and so on. And the point I was making is that this process of new companies emerging and also at the same time old companies being replaced happens at a much faster pace in these countries than it does in India. And so the point I was making is that maybe India needs to pay attention to the creation of new conglomerates, new companies that are more nimble and can deal with technology. So this is basically the point. Of course, India is now the third largest home to the third largest ecosystem of startups. So there's a real boom in startups in India, but we need to take them from being, new startups and rapidly scale them up to becoming real world beaters. And this again fits to the earlier point we made that there is this huge opportunity, and we as policymakers are conscious that it is we who have to move fast and make sure that some of these companies become world beaters.
But the opportunities that are being talked about at the moment, possibly by the loudest voices, is mostly about bringing manufacturing back, or kind of bringing the services, perhaps not necessarily in the innovative fields, but more about using the labor force to create or moving supply chains here. So could then, in that case, if India does take advantage of the trade opportunities provided, the supply chain opportunities, then push back against this creative destruction you're talking about, which requires kind of from the ground up innovation, risk-taking, and thinking outside the box?
All of these are interconnected. You can't really separate them out. For example, when you're saying using India's labor force, well, do remember that virtually all the top U.S. technology companies have their captive offices and operations in India. Some of them outside of the US, they're probably the largest operation. So when we are talking about US companies doing cutting edge work in chip design or artificial intelligence, do remember that those are happening in India in their offices in Bangalore or Hyderabad or Chennai or Gurgaon. So, I think India has moved far beyond the old days of cheap labor and BPO now. We are doing a lot of cutting edge work in multiple areas. And so all we want to do is to replicate this in manufacturing as well. So of course, like for example, in Apple, we are currently just putting stuff together and screwing them together to create the iPhone. But that's where China did as well, just assembly. And then you move up the value chain, you begin to create various things. We are now investing into chips and so on. But, this is not just about electronics. I'll give you another example of a sector where we think we can compete. Shipbuilding. Today, 60% of shipbuilding in the world is done out of one country, China. But we have every ingredient of being able to succeed in shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is about steel and literally millions of hours of welding. So we have the labor to do it. We have the steel to do it. We have the coastline to do it. We have our own domestic demand to do it. India is very well positioned in the Indian Ocean to be a transshipment port area. And of course, very importantly, we have our technology as well. I mean, India is one of the few countries in the world that can build nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. So I can assure you we can also build tankers and container ships. So all the pieces are there. Now, of course, it requires for both the public sector and the private sector to collaborate to create the capacity and to go out there and compete. And so this is a sector where we have begun to move. There's a lot of interest from global companies like Mitsubishi, Hyundai, many of the European shipbuilding majors. So, just as an example of a sector where all the ingredients exist, for whatever reason, we haven't built out that shipbuilding industry so far, But we are now doing it, and all our ship yards are packed with orders. Some of old shipyards which had kind of closed down, like Pipavav, have been reopened, and suddenly we are a player in a sector where we had been written off.
Right, and going back to how other countries are now seeing India and possibly the opportunities that India will can give in terms of manufacturing or shifting supply chains, is India's government looking, how closely is India's government looking at that? And how much is the government buffering itself against changes in U.S. policy? For instance, if Trump tomorrow makes a deal with China, as far as tariffs go, so that maybe those supply chains don't need to be shifted?
Look, that's why I said right in the beginning, these are opportunities, but we have to be flexible to an evolving situation. Every situation will have its upsides and its downsides. The importance is for policymakers and for our private sector to be flexible and dynamic, and not to be completely dependent on some tariff war that is happening in the rest of the world. That is exactly why the point I was making when I said these are opportunities that we have to grab. But what exactly those are and how that evolves is something that we will find out as things happen. Our job is to make sure we keep investing in the infrastructure, we keep investing in our domestic capabilities, and we are doing it in certain areas like in services. We are at the cutting edge. Manufacturing is where we are not, and we recognize that. And so that is why we are also building into that as well. But these FTAs that we are now negotiating with the US, with the United Kingdom, are very close to getting done. It should be done in the next few months. And then the European Union as well.
Okay, I want to lift the lid a little bit on this discussion on creative destruction. You talked about the U.S. and China having kind of new innovative companies making it into the top 10 in terms of market capital. What does India's top 10 look like compared to 10 years ago, and how much of a change have we seen in that?
So the point I was making there is that India's top 10 still looks like companies like the Tata Consultancy Services, Reliance, and so on, that have existed were there. There were large companies even back in the 90s or even earlier in some cases. So the point I was making is that we need new companies to emerge, create more sort of fire internally. The good news is that there are some very interesting companies coming up the value chain. For example, Oyo. Right, it's an Indian company. It's perhaps the world's first or second largest owner of hotel rooms, competing with Airbnb. Set up by a very young Indian. I think he was 18 when he set it up. And then over the last decade, it has basically become a huge company. You have another company, Urban Company, which is a supplier of all kinds of urban services. So there has been a huge amount of new companies that have emerged. Some of them have reached some scale. They're getting listed. There are, of course, services companies like food delivery and all kinds of new things. So there has been success in certain kinds of areas. Even in manufacturing, we have now seen a lot of new companies emerge in areas like drones and geospatial mapping and so on. So it's not that we don't have new companies. I'm just pointing out these companies now need to go out there and compete with our old companies for space in the top 10. And I think that energy that is visible already on the ground and even in the middle levels now, that needs to push through into the big area. And it's really that competitive spirit. And you see, you will see in the next 20 years, amazing companies coming out of India, which you have never heard of before.
So what needs to change in the business or entrepreneurial ecosystem to make that happen faster, as we've seen in the US and China?
Private sector needs to invest more in R&D. But I think here in India, where, as a policymaker, let me say, we need to be much more comfortable with completely new companies. It could be foreign companies as well, entering the market and, causing the churn. One of the reasons the United States remains the world's largest economy is look at the sheer number of new companies that continuously roll over big companies are replaced by new companies. And I just was making the argument this should happen in India as well. There's no reason we can't. Indians go all over the world and are, at the cutting edge of all kinds of new innovations in the US. In fact, the point I was making about the US is many of those companies are set up or run by Indians. So they can do it at home. And the good news, as I said, is that this is now beginning to happen.
Saying that India's economy has been doing incredibly well at $4.3 trillion. India's GDP doubled over the past 10 years. It outpaces all nations in the G7 and G20 and BRICS. Going back to that growth, how do you see India sustaining that growth? Especially now we're seeing a lot of competition, particularly in the tech sector.
Well, there are many drivers of this growth. One of them is that over the last decade, we have dramatically upgraded our infrastructure. India was infamous for poor infrastructure, but if you visit India now, you will see that it's a gigantic construction site. Mumbai is, in fact, the largest concentration of cranes in the world right now. It will, in the next 6 months, have a brand new metro system with 13 new lines. It already has a new coastal road. It will have a new airport on the mainland. The connecting bridge to that has already been opened. So, just one city and the huge amount of construction. So first, dramatic improvement in physical infrastructure. Second major thing that has changed is the fact that we have become quite conscious of the ease of doing business. A few years ago, we lowered taxes dramatically. We have this year reduced taxes on the middle class. And so a continuous focus on improving ease of doing business. The Prime Minister has also promised a deregulation commission, which you shall hear about in the next few months. So a big effort to make, the old story of India being, tied up in red tape, make that history. So that is the second major area. Third, obviously, is the fact that the way the global order has broken down plays to us in some ways. I mean, when the global order, the old global order was set up, we were not a major player in the world. So the rules were not set up by us. We were just rule takers. But now in this new environment, a fluid situation is clearly good for an emerging economy like ours. An emerging economic power will always like a situation to be fluid because it allows us to create our own space, which is precisely what we are doing in this tariff war situation, and we discussed that earlier. There are many other things. I mean, I could talk about the old stuff like demographic dividend and so on. Those are also important ingredients in this. But the net result of all of this is that there is a dynamism here that despite all this uncertainty, we are growing at somewhere between 6.5% to 7%. Mm-hmm. We can, if the world looks a little bit more stable, easily grow at over 7, even 8%, because frankly, we have been quite restrained in our domestic policies because of the uncertainty outside. This car is capable of going much faster, but the road we find ourselves on has got lots of potholes. So we are being careful, but we have lots of fiscal and monetary room that we could utilize if there are any shocks in the system, and indeed if the global economy opens up into, after a new equilibrium is established in a year or two, we will be in a position to ramp up growth very dramatically, even from current levels.
And is there any particular sector that you have your eye on that can help fuel that extra margin of growth?
We are a large economy, so we will not be able to do specifically one sector. Obviously, things related to electronics and so on are important. And of course, Taiwan would be an important partner in that. But frankly, there are already areas where we are big, like, for example, pharmaceuticals and chemicals. The services sector has been our strength for a long time, and we would like to build up on that. Artificial intelligence is an area that we intend to adopt quite aggressively, although we recognize that there are downsides to it, and there are areas we need to regulate. But the fact is that we are quite enthusiastic adopters of that, even in policy. For example, our tax systems are now heavily use artificial intelligence. There are many areas in policy making that we are using artificial intelligence and so on. So if you visit an Indian airport, for example, increasingly you enter just using your face, rather than a boarding card through Digi-Yatra. So there are many other things where we are using it. And we will continue to adopt many technologies.
You mentioned the new global order, and China, of course, is one of the biggest disruptors of the old global order. And one of the ways they've done that is through its Belt and Road initiative. Does India have anything like that, as clear-cut as that, in its future plans to engage the rest of the world?
So we obviously do have relationships with various countries, including the West. There have been discussions of the IMEC corridor through to Europe, through the Middle East, and so on. But our general approach has been more fluid than that of China. China tends to have a much more top-down driven approach to things. We tend to have a much more bottom-up, fluid approach to things. So while we are not either a participant in RCEP or in Belt and Road, we have instead gone for a more network type approach, which is bottom up. And this, however, does not mean that we are not responding. There are many areas we are investing into, including, as I said, creating infrastructure build out with our partners. By the way, we already have free trade agreements with, for example, the UAE. We have one with Australia that we have come up with. So, in the Indian Ocean region, we are building networks up. But as I said, it is not the top-down kind of driven, the top-down driven approach that China has.
And if we bring it back to India and what's been happening domestically, can you tell us how the Make in India campaign has changed the landscape or the economic landscape of India, and where that leaves room for foreign investment?
So Make in India, by the way, includes foreign investment. Our point is you come here and make in India. It could be Indian companies, but we are quite happy to host foreign companies. Apple is just one that we have talked about, and so Foxconn is here already. And we are inviting companies. In fact, there are many companies where, whether it's Siemens and Bosch, which are German companies, or many American companies that are coming here to India. And in the services space, we are already a very big player. It's in manufacturing that we are not a part of the global supply chains. But even here, there are certain segments that have grown suddenly out of nowhere. For example, the Indian defense sector. We had some sort of a defense sector for years, mostly public sector driven. But that sector rarely exported anything. And in fact, we ourselves were heavily dependent on imports. That has changed in the last 5 years alone. We are now not only producing a lot of things for ourselves, but we have now become, I wouldn't call ourselves yet a major exporter, but a significant exporter of defense products. And I can see that in the next another 5 years, we'll be actually quite a major exporter of quite a few things. So defense is one area. There are other areas as well where we have Make in India has been a success. We would obviously want this to spread into areas like textiles and so on, which we would think historically we were very strong in. But in recent times, we have grown much slower than, say, countries like Vietnam or even Bangladesh. So we would like to expand those areas as well. But as I said, we are a large country. So it will require us to have a broad front of areas where we will expand quickly. I had earlier talked about shipbuilding as well. So those are kinds of areas that we are looking at.
I want to move to an issue that's currently in the headlines, and that's the India-Pakistan tensions. Can you see these tensions, especially if they are long-running, derailing India's growth strategy or trajectory?
India does not wish to be in conflict with anyone in any prolonged period. But as you are aware, that a specific incident, in fact, a series of incidents has led to this situation. And it's very unfortunate. And we do hope that, countries that promote terrorist attacks on other countries would refrain from doing so.
Right. Going back to manufacturing now, I will leave the geopolitics out here. India and Taiwan are creating several partnerships in manufacturing semiconductors, and Taiwan is a key player in this in India's semiconductor ambitions. Why do you think, or why has India made it a centerpiece of its move forward or its economic growth to manufacture its own semiconductors? Why is that so important for India?
Because you see, we are already a major player in many areas. For example, car manufacturing, or other areas that we either already exist in or intend to expand into. Defense is another one. And one of the experiences we had during the COVID pandemic is that we are heavily dependent on imports of certain critical ingredients. It could be even in pharmaceuticals, where there is a single source somewhere on the planet that we get it from. And for whatever reason, it could be a pandemic, an earthquake, military conflict, whatever reason it may be, if that source suddenly stops, then you can find that the rest of the entire thing gets jammed. I mean, we found that in automobiles, for example. We are a major manufacturer and exporter of automobiles, but because certain chips were unavailable, you could make the whole car. You could everything, tires, seats, everything, engine, everything. But then some chip is missing and then you're stuck. So we think that we, at least in certain areas, we need to have some critical capability of doing this for these kind of situations. And a country our size has enough domestic demand, and we are big enough in certain export segments that we can more than justify creating this. But this means that there has to be a critical mass of investment to get going, to create the ecosystem. So ironically, India is one of the major centers for designing of the chips, but we were not building them. So we want to create some capability of doing it.
Right, and coming back to Taiwan, Taiwan is, I would say, not among the major trade partners of India, but bilateral trade in 2024 reached a record high at about nearly 11 billion. How much talk is there about charting more trade partnerships with Taiwan in general? How much is that part of India's foreign policy when it comes to expanding trade or its economy? And is a free trade agreement on the cards?
Well, I'm not up to date on whether a free trade agreement is being negotiated right now. But in general, the point is we want to expand areas who we want to trade with. And certainly Taiwan is one of the countries where we would like to expand our trade. There are many areas of complementarity. You already discussed, our interest in, bringing electronics, chips, etc., into our mutual investment and trade relationship. And there are many things we would like to be able to export to the Taiwan as well. There are, India, as I said, is a major producer of all kinds of products, from pharmaceuticals to textiles to leather products and so on. And we would like to explore Taiwan as an export destination. So it works both ways. As I said, I'm not completely up to speed on where free trade agreement discussions are. But the fact of the matter is that we would like to have much, much closer trade relations with Taiwan.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Sanjeev Sanyal, author, historian, and member of the Indian Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, for joining us from New Delhi. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
What steps do you think India should take to challenge global economic giants like U.S. and China? Leave your thoughts and comments below and click the video beside me for a discussion on India-Taiwan semiconductor collaborations, its prospects and pitfalls. And subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell if you don't want to miss more stories on tech and business from Taiwan.